Hey everybody, welcome to Space Camp. Doing the space thing today. So just by way of quick introduction, my name's Derek. I'm a reformed product marketing exec who now builds software to help product marketers launch stuff. So most recently, before that though, I stood up the product marketing function at Rippling, where helped them scale up from 10-person team into a $7 billion valuation. I've launched hundreds of products at places like PlayStation, BBVA, a whole bunch of other small startups as well. And so today we're going to talk about launching stuff and how to operationalize this process, turn it from a really chaotic cost center into a competitive advantage. So we all know in today's world, there's more stuff launching, more companies competing on fewer channels, and it's harder to stand out than it ever has been before. You got products, you got campaigns, new features, events, new markets, all these things launching, and that number is actually growing 27% year over year. So we talk a lot as product marketers about using positioning as a way to stand out in this market. And that's true, but there's something that we often forget, which is great positioning doesn't really mean anything if nobody hears that story. So we really need to figure out how to stand out in a noisy market. And the not so secret to doing this is to create marketable moments, right? It's to turn every single product or feature that we're building and every market that we're entering, every campaign that we're launching into a really singular event that helps draw focus onto that thing long enough for our positioning to stick. It's to really spend the time to create that powerful message, but then give it the activation energy that it needs in order to feel important enough to the people that we're talking to that they pay attention to it. So it's kind of launch stuff. And I also want to just clarify, as we're talking about launching today, we're not really talking about just launch day. We're talking about all the stuff leading up to and following launch day, because all of that strategic work that we build out in the go-to-market process is what lays the foundation for all the ongoing growth work that we do over time. So I just want to quickly gut check what everybody's experience is with launching. So raise your hands if, basically if you're launching things on a yearly basis, whether those are big or small things. Cool, and keep them up if you're launching on a monthly basis. And keep them up if you're launching weekly. Cool, we got a couple of people launching stuff every week. That's great. And how many stakeholders are you working with? Put them up if you're working with more than 2. More than 10? More than 20? Very cross-functional. And how many of you actually have a defined launch process that you follow? Cool, and now trick question, keep them up if you follow it for every single launch that you do. Okay, and for bonus points, put your hands up if your company actually treats the launch process as a really business critical function. A couple of you, good. And just quickly think to yourself, if you're in the front, you can throw out some words, but what comes to mind when you think about the launch process? Just kind of marinate on what you feel. Chaos. You're leading into my next slide well. Everything is on fire constantly. That sounds about right. Details. Fun. I like it. Touching on my last slide. Cool. So yeah. So just looking at some of the data on this from the State of Go-to-Market report last year that Product Marketing Alliance did. So the average product marketer is launching about 10 to 16 things a year. So basically, they're launching things on a monthly cadence when you're talking about big stuff. When you start talking about small things like new feature releases and policy updates, that number actually balloons up to 65 plus. Unsurprisingly, very cross-functional. The average product marketer is working with 10 or more stakeholders, and the most surprising piece here, though, is that less than a third of product marketers actually reported having a defined and consistently implemented launch process, which is just wild to me because this is such a critical part of our job as product marketers. But a couple of you said chaos. When I talk to product marketers all day, every day about this stuff, and consistently that is the word that I hear most. So, raise your hand if this slide feels a little bit familiar. Yeah, so we've all clearly internalized as product marketers that launches are chaotic, right? But the thing that we forget too often is that chaos actually drives real negative business outcomes and drives a lot of cost for the company. So how many of you actually heard of Netflix games? Okay, there's a couple of you. I'm surprised. Not many though. So Netflix launched this a couple of months ago. Huge initiative for them. They probably spent hundreds of millions of dollars building it. a lot of money to launch it, and 3 months after launch, less than 1% of their audience had even heard about it. Not just adopted it, but heard about it. And these are the kind of flops that when you launch, it doesn't just get execs upset, it actually gets whole divisions shut down over it. And I don't have some great insight into why exactly this flopped, but having been through enough of these myself, and it sounds like probably a lot of you have experienced this as well, a lot of the challenge probably came down to the fact that they did not align internal teams effectively enough to activate all the channels that they had available to them, and they just under-leveraged the materials that they had at hand. Because launches can really be expensive processes if they're done ineffectively. You end up frustrating internal teams, and I've talked to lots of product marketers who have left their companies because of poor launch processes, and that costs twice as much as that employee's salary to replace. You end up confusing customers, and those customers end up churning, and that costs 5 times as much as the revenue of that customer to replace. You light hundreds of hours of product development time on fire, and you also leave potentially huge amounts of revenue opportunity on the table. So this can be expensive even at small companies, where a launch can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if you get it wrong. But at bigger companies, this can go up to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And IDC actually did some research on this, and they found that for every $1 billion of revenue generated industry-wide across large companies, small companies, in a variety of different industries, $100 million of that is lost every year due to ineffective go-to-market. But enough about the downsides. Let's talk about how launches can kind of be a superpower for growth. The very best companies in the world, like PlayStation, Apple, Salesforce, they really use launches masterfully to grow. And up to 60% of their revenue can come during a launch window. But this isn't really just the domain of large companies. Small companies can do this too. So before Uber was the Uber that we know today, Uber was using launches, mini launches, as a really powerful growth lever for themselves, like their Uber for Puppies campaign. Early days Slack attributes a ton of their early days success to how effectively they built out a release notes process that really effectively communicated their product velocity to customers and helped share change. And I even have some fun startup launch stories myself. I worked for a small keyboard app company called Flexi, and we would turn every single feature release into this really big event. One of them we even won a Guinness World Record around, and used that as a mechanism to help turn that story into a much larger one that we ended up being able to even get press around as a very, very tiny startup. So what do all these companies actually do differently around this, right? First and foremost, the biggest thing that they do is that they approach every single launch with a very different mindset from most companies. They don't think of launches as just another thing to communicate or another project to complete. They think of it as an opportunity to create step change impact on their revenue growth. So if you think about growth kind of like a race car, your company is constantly doing all of this evergreen stuff day to day in order to grow. Your sales is selling, demand gen's running ads, products optimizing features, and that stuff's your engine. It's kind of the stuff that's gonna make you go, and your company's constantly gonna be optimizing to push that faster and faster and really max out their RPMs. But launches, the real magic of them is that they act like gear shifts. They're an opportunity to really step up your growth from one level to another, because when you introduce a new product or a new feature or a new market, it unlocks a new top speed. Suddenly you've added a new revenue line, or you've expanded your TAM, or you've suddenly added the ability for yourself to unlock a really retention-driving feature gap. And they're also like gear shifts because they help just make everything else more efficient for a period of time, because the human brain and your customer's brain is wired to pay attention to newness. And so when you introduce a new shiny object, it draws people's attention to it long enough for your positioning to stick. So the companies that are getting this stuff right, they really think of these gear shifts are the key to winning or losing the race. And 80% of CMOs actually think that the launches are critical to make or break long-term product success. And this really isn't even considering all the knock-on impacts that they can have, because launches don't just increase revenue, they don't just increase your actual metrics, but they also have all these qualitative benefits. They help shape company positioning, they help improve internal morale, and they also make all of your enablement processes more scalable. But mindset's really not enough, right? Because launches don't really fail for the reasons that we think that they do. In theory, the go-to-market process is pretty straightforward, right? You build a thing, you figure out the right audience for it, you go launch it, or you plan out how you're gonna launch it, and then everybody goes and does the thing, and you collect your awesome results later. So most companies, when they think about why their launches failed, they think about strategy. They're like, did we build the right thing? Did we use the right channels? Did we target the right audience? Did we spend the right amount of money? But strategy is rarely actually the problem here. The problem is really whether or not the company internally is equipped to put that strategy into action. So McKinsey did some interesting research a couple of years ago, and they basically looked at hundreds of launch processes across small companies and large companies in tech, CPG, entertainment, variety of different industries. And they found that there was actually zero correlation between launch success and things like budgets or frequency of launching or how big the company was, all the things that you would think normally would have an impact on whether or not a launch succeeds or fails. The three things that they found that had very direct correlation with launch success were whether or not companies had a repeatable, proactive planning motion, how effective their internal comms were, and how effectively they were actually utilizing research in that process. So, end of the day, it kind of comes down to alignment, and that makes sense, right? Comms can't get press if they don't know that the thing's coming. Sales can't sell if they don't know how to talk about it. And demand gen can't promote it if they don't have the assets that they need in order to get those campaigns live. And also importantly, nobody in the company is actually gonna be motivated to do that stuff if they don't understand the why behind why you're launching that new thing. So it's really important to get everybody on the same page about why you're launching, who you're launching to, what story you need to tell, where you need to tell it, and how you're gonna do all that stuff. And I've talked to hundreds of product marketers about this, and through all of that, it's become very clear where the common failure points are. So let's talk about how we diagnose whether or not our go-to-market process is working. So first and foremost, you need to ask yourself, are people constantly asking, why are we doing it this way? Or are they arguing about strategy? If that's the case, the challenge that they have is that they don't have enough visibility into the context on the product strategy or go-to-market strategy side of things as to why you're launching the thing the way that you are. So, and oftentimes this is because all of that context is living off in some deck or tool elsewhere, separate from all the work that's happening. So, I've talked to tons of PMMs and they constantly are complaining to me about, hey, I'm not getting enough engagement on this beautiful persona that I built. And then they tell me that persona lives in some slide deck that's, persona v2.56 version 5. And it's living off in a place that nobody knows where to find it. So you really have to have this stuff embedded in the plans themselves. Second thing to diagnose is, are you personally always feeling like you're kind of scrambling and reinventing the wheel every single time you launch things and you're not having enough time to plan? And this is often a symptom of not having operationalized your process enough. So if you haven't created a process or road mapping process where you are directly embedded with product in informing and understanding what's being built, and more importantly, if you haven't actually defined your own launch process and built a tiering system, built a standard bill of materials that adapts to different types and sizes of launches, then you're just constantly going to be in this reactive, chaotic mode. And the third issue is if sales and success are constantly off message and they're really struggling to communicate this, or if you're not getting enough campaign support from demand gen. The challenge here is probably that you are not communicating proactively enough. Again, if you're relying on other people to go find the information that you've created, they're not gonna find it because it's not top of mind for them and they're not paying attention to exactly where this stuff lives on a daily basis. So you need to be pushing information to people proactively constantly. It needs to be a pulsing motion. And as PMMs, we need to really be thinking about ourselves as drivers as opposed to as passengers who are passively enabling all this stuff. And look, fixing this stuff, it feels hard, but it's very possible, and doing so helps to up-level your team as a strategic driver because you get a process that's really repeatable, it's transparent, and it creates that tight alignment that you want across the team. And getting that process right helps turn you into, as a product marketer, into a strategic driver in the company around a commercialization process. So let's talk about like how we actually do that, right? So we talked about mindset earlier. The first step is to actually shift your mindset from a project mindset to a product mindset. So when we think about launches as projects to complete that are ad hoc, the checklist kind of becomes the focus instead of the outcomes. And so you need to actually start thinking about your process as a product that product marketing is responsible for, and your internal teams are your customers. So like any good product, they need to be made aware of your product. So they need to know what your process is, so you need to be showing your work, and they also need to have a clear buying motion for where to go consume that product. So you also need to give them a clear location to go that is a single source of truth, where they really understand exactly where to go when they need to consume and buy your go-to-market product. Also, that product needs to be good, so your strategy needs to be well-researched and informed. And the outcome of all this stuff is that you end up with teams that are enabled and motivated to go and promote this new thing that you're building. And your goal is to build a machine that repeatably delivers that value. And so through the product lens, the other thing that you should be thinking about is like every single thing that you're doing is really a launch, like small feature releases, campaigns, big product introductions, new markets. All of those things follow roughly the same go-to-market motion. They're just slightly different shapes and sizes of them. So again, you should be thinking about how you can create a process that encompasses all of those different activities and delivers that value repeatably to your internal stakeholders. So our goal is ultimately to turn that like really broken handoff process that we were talking about earlier into a clearly built system where information flows cleanly from the research process to the build process to the go-to-market planning process and through to post-launch measurement. And it's a cycle where all of that information is directly connected. There's a number of ways to systematize this, but regardless of the way that you choose to systematize it, there's a few common components that we need to have in a good productized process. So first and foremost, it needs to be consistently implementable, but it also needs to be flexible enough to adapt to those different types of launches that we talked about. So what that means is that you need to have a standard bill of materials for different types and sizes of launches, which includes tasks, dependencies, assets you're gonna create, and that needs to be implemented for every single thing that you launch so that you can minimize the time that you spend actually structuring your plans and maximize the time spent on creating that strategy and doing that research that informs it. The second is that context needs to be married to content. So every handoff from product to product marketing to sales needs to carry through the why and the research that informed that why. So first and foremost, that really means that you need to kind of centralize your process in a single source of truth, which, whether that's a big doc or it's a platform, you just need a launch hub where anybody can go and understand exactly what is launching when and get access to the rationale behind why those things are being launched the way that they are. And just as a side note, if you're not doing research as part of your process, that's a problem as well. You really need to be doing, anytime you're introducing something new, you should be getting on the phone with customers, you should be conducting message testing surveys, you should be doing pricing research if needed. And if a launch is too small to warrant that, you should have a continuous research process that you're able to draw from so that every launch is still being informed by something. So the third thing that we need is our launch process needs to be proactive in its communication. So that means that, this one's a little more out of your hands, but your product team is maintaining a clear roadmap so that you can actually plan ahead. But with what is in our hands is that our communication outwards to the other teams within the company needs to be proactive and it needs to really resemble a pulsing motion. So what that looks like in practice is weekly status updates to the direct collaborators that you have within your go-to-market planning motion. But more broadly to the rest of the organization, you should be sending a monthly newsletter that rolls up all the things that were launched last month, all the things that are launching this month, and gives reinforcement to the messaging and the assets that are available to promote those. You really need to proactively get this information to those teammates. Otherwise, again, they're just not gonna find it. And we also need to be thinking about ways to automate this process as well. So you should have systems in place to automate that handoff from product to product marketing. You should have systems in place to help automate these internal comms, and you should have systems in place to conduct research. Because we, as PMMs, we just have too much stuff to do, and so we need to systematize as much of it as possible. When you do this, it can give you pretty incredible leverage. So I built a system like this at Rippling early days. It helped a 3-person product marketing team to enable a 12 product line, now 30 product line organization with hundreds of salespeople. And Ignition didn't exist at the time, so we used Airtable to build out the process. And basically what we did is we built out a tiering framework in Airtable with a variety of different templates, and that was directly connected into the product team's roadmap. It would carry through every single time a new release was created, carry through all the personas and PRDs and context that was created on the product side of the house. And then it would automatically output monthly roll-ups that included the most up-to-date messaging to the rest of the organization, what had recently launched, what was launching in the near future. And it made the communication incredibly seamless between all the different teams. So before I leave you all, I'm just going to share a quick little framework for kind of recapping the stuff that we talked about today. And it's unsurprisingly, because I'm not very creative, called the launch framework. So remember, first and foremost, launch often and make everything a marketable moment. Invest the time in automating a repeatable process and creating a tiering structure that includes a consistent bill of materials with tasks, dependencies, and common assets. And unify your process in a single source of truth. Maintain all of that context in one place so that anybody can come and know exactly where to go for that. Narrate those plans through research and make sure that you're housing that what and why together. Be really proactive about updating cross-functional teams in that pulsing motion, so that rather than relying on them to come to you. And lastly, remember to have fun, because launches are exciting. And all this stuff takes energy to put into place, but you will thank me for it later. One final note that I'll give, and then cover a lot of the detail probably in questions, is when it comes to rolling out new processes, one of the biggest questions I get is how do I actually introduce a new process to cross-functional teams, because nobody really likes to change process. The biggest piece of advice I give you is just go do it. Don't really wait for permission or consensus. Go structure a process, show people what it looks like in the wild, in reality, and let them jump on board once they see the value of it, because they will see the value of it very quickly as they're getting this better communication through the process. So with that, any questions?
Okay, a few questions. You define what could be considered a launch. I know everyone has different standards and tiers, but in terms of what a product marketer, how they should spend their time launch.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I think when we talk about launches, the thing that immediately comes to mind is obviously a net new product, right? Where it's a new packaged up thing that has a price associated with it. But the way that I like to think about launches is, again, it's anything that has that repeatable new introduction of a thing process. So that includes small feature releases, which are technically a launch, they're just a smaller version of it. It includes brand campaigns where you're doing integrated campaign planning and you're launching on a specific date. It includes, again, policy updates where you're launching a communication to a person. So it's really anything where you're introducing an announcement.
Okay, love this last question, and I'll add to it, but how do you handle launch when product releases in phases? Do you recommend waiting until all phases? Oh, it disappeared again. Where did it go? See what I mean? I'm not crazy. Okay, hold on. Let me find it. Okay. Okay. I don't know where.
Waiting until all phases are shipped before officially launching is my question.
But then also to add to that, oh, it's yours? Okay, thank you. But then to add to that, beta or early access, limited availability, GA. Who decides GA? Because sometimes product is it's ready. And I'm no, it's not. We decide.
Yep. So I think when we talk about a launch date, I am typically talking about what is the GA date? What is the day that we are announcing to all of the world that this thing exists? But you should actually be having kind of mini launches along the way to smaller audiences. So when you're shipping to alpha, you're probably just working with kind of internal teams and or friends or family. Once you're shipping to beta, you ideally have a small beta group that you've already curated that you can go ahead and reach out to, and you're doing a quiet soft launch to those people where you're doing another announcement, and you still need to have a communications plan for that specific beta introduction, but you're not introducing using all of the channels available to you. And then, GA is GA, and that's when you're making the big splashy announcement to the world.
Okay, and then last question. How do you tackle or position a relaunch? Let's be real. Sometimes the GTM process might not fail, and you know what? It wasn't our fault. And not to name names, but if it was like due to product gaps, like the product wasn't ready, it wasn't complete, it shouldn't have shipped to begin with. Question, or the teams weren't ready for a new persona. How many times have we been at a company where it's like, oh, cool, really good at selling apples to people who like apples, and we're like, oh my god, these people who like apples, they're totally gonna love oranges too, no big deal, and then they don't. So suggestions.
Yeah, relaunches are an interesting one. It is fairly context dependent. So in some cases, you may want to actually relaunch under a completely different brand. If, for example, you went out to a persona and just completely flopped, and I think more products actually should be flexible about rebranding and relaunching at that level. But generally, like the biggest piece of advice there is make sure that you are actually learning from the previous launch. And so make sure that you are going back and directly referencing all of that context that you had from the past launch and applying any things that didn't work. I think when it comes to like how do you message a relaunch, so one approach is to be fairly transparent and open about it, and like, hey, we launched, before, and we've got, we've changed the product, we've updated it, we've found a new persona, we're relaunching to this new audience, and like customers tend to understand that. But the other approach that you can take is just pretend that the old launch didn't happen. It's, the reality is you can launch many, many times with the same product, and a lot of your audience is not going to see every single launch that you do, and so it's okay to go out and launch with the same message over and over again and just continue to reinforce it over time with people. So I think there's a couple of different approaches. Unfortunately, it's like fairly context dependent, so I can't give a clear answer on that one, but